All right, ready to dive deeper into this whole pessimism and humility thing?
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, I got some really interesting excerpts here from a couple sources, oh7.pdf and oh8.pdf. They really got me thinking,
Yeah,
like about how maybe pessimism isn't always such a bad thing and how humility is way more than just, being all quiet and modest.
hmm. Definitely some assumptions to unpack
Yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Oh7.pdf really dives into the unexpected power of pessimism, Like it actually argues that those folks who are always planning for the worst case scenario.
To pessimists. Yeah.
Exactly. They actually have a leg up when it comes to, well, realistic planning. They don't just hope for the best, they actually think about what could go wrong and prepare for it.
It's almost like they're, I don't know, kind of have a superpower, like being able to see those obstacles ahead of time so they can plan better.
Right. And the source even talks about this thing called premortem analysis.
Mortem analysis.
Yeah.
Ah,
Sounds intense, right? But it's basically like you imagine a project has totally failed and then try to figure out all the reasons why.
oh, interesting. So working backwards from failure to like pinpoint weaknesses before they even happen.
Exactly. I actually tried this with a presentation I was working on last week.
Really?
Yeah, and it was amazing how many things I caught that I would totally missed otherwise.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. So it's not just about preventing those total disasters, but it's also about managing risk effectively. And oh7.pdf really highlighted that too.
So if you're already thinking about what could go wrong,
You're way better at actually assessing those risks and figuring out how to, reduce them.
makes sense.
Yeah.
But doesn't it all depend on what kind of pessimism we're talking about?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. And oh7.pdf dives into that too, like different types of pessimism. There's defensive pessimism and dispositional pessimism.
Defensive pessimism.
Yeah, that's when, like, people use negative thinking as a way to manage anxiety and prepare for tough situations, the stressful ones.
Oh, okay. So it's not that they're just like doom and gloom all the time. It's more like they're using this kind of strategic pessimism to their advantage.
Exactly. So,
Interesting.
like, yeah, pessimism, like anything else, can have good and bad sides to it.
For sure.
So, like, think about that big event you mentioned, right? A defensive pessimist planning that wouldn't just be focused on what could go wrong, but they'd be using that to come up with backup plans, solutions. So it's less about fearing failure and more about being prepared.
Totally. Which actually ties into another benefit of pessimism that the source talks about, lowered expectations.
Oh, yeah, I was a little skeptical of that one at first, I'll admit.
Yeah, I get it. We're always told to think positive, aim high.
Right.
But the source makes the point that when we set the bar crazy high, we're kind of setting ourselves up for disappointment.
Yeah.
Whereas if we go in with those expectations a bit lower,
You might be pleasantly surprised.
exactly.
It's like when you brace yourself for bad news and then it's not so bad after all.
Uh-huh.
Like, phew, okay, that wasn't as terrible as I thought.
And the source even says that can lead to more resilience.
Makes sense if you're not constantly getting thrown off by things not going perfectly.
Right. You've already built in a buffer.
Yeah. So I guess it's not about being a total pessimist, seeing the world through like dark colored glasses,
Right.
but more about just like adding a touch of realism to your thinking, Bit of caution.
I like that, finding that balance
Yeah.
between, being hopeful and being prepared.
Exactly. This whole balance thing, it really makes you think, especially when we start looking at oh8.pdf and what it says about humility. I always thought humility was about like downplaying your achievements, kind of putting yourself last.
Yeah, that's a pretty common misunderstanding.
right.
But this source, oh8.pdf, it paints a much bigger picture of humility. It defines it as having a really accurate and balanced view of yourself, like, acknowledging your strengths and your limitations.
So not about denying your talents or pretending to be like less than you are.
No, not at all. True humility is about recognizing you don't have all the answers, that you're still learning, still growing, and that sometimes you need help.
Like that Socrates quote, the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing.
Exactly. And oh8.pdf suggests that this kind of self-awareness, this is really crucial for growth, personal growth, and for building those strong relationships too.
Because if you're always trying to prove how smart you are, how capable, you just close yourself off to new ideas, right?
Precisely.
Different perspectives.
Humility lets you approach everything with a sense of curiosity,
Yeah.
openness. You really listen to others, genuinely interested, and you're willing to learn from your mistakes.
But this source also talks about false humility,
Oh, yeah.
which I've definitely seen. There are people who are always putting themselves down, but it's like
Yeah.
almost calculated.
Yes. The source really highlights that difference, emphasizing that true humility comes from a place of genuineness,
Yeah.
self-acceptance,
hmm
but false humility. That's often used to get attention or validation.
Like fishing for compliments.
Exactly. And that could really damage relationships because it just erodes trust. It's not authentic.
So how can you tell the difference between someone who's truly humble and someone who's just putting on a show?
O8.pdf says to pay attention to their actions, their demeanor. Do they genuinely listen to others?
Mm.
Acknowledge their contributions? Are they willing to admit they're wrong? Or are they constantly seeking praise and downplaying their achievements, but it just feels fake?
Those are some good things to look out for.
Yeah.
But how do you actually cultivate true humility? It can't be easy to shift from always trying to prove yourself to like genuine self-acceptance.
It takes effort, for sure. Practice. But O8.pdf gives some practical advice. Like, focus on active listening.
Oh, yeah.
Really give your full attention to others. Don't interrupt. Don't try to steer the conversation back to yourself.
That's something I'm working on. It's so easy to just get caught up in your own thoughts, wanting to share your own experiences.
Yeah.
But true humility is about taking a step back, really hearing what other people have to say.
Exactly. Another important practice is giving credit where credit is due. Acknowledge the contributions of others, even if it means sharing the spotlight, letting someone else take the lead.
Which can be tough,
Oh, yeah.
especially when everyone's trying to get ahead.
Yeah.
But recognizing that success is rarely a solo act, that's a sign of true humility.
It is.
There are usually so many people who help us along the way.
Mhm.
It's important to acknowledge their part in it.
Definitely. And maybe the most challenging, but also most rewarding part of humility, being willing to admit when you're wrong.
Ooh, that one's tough.
Own up to your mistakes and see them as opportunities to grow, to learn.
That can be a real blow to the ego. But you're right, O8.pdf makes a strong case for reframing mistakes as valuable.
Absolutely. It's about having the courage to say, okay, I messed up. What can I learn from this?
hmm
That kind of self-awareness is really powerful.
Not about beating yourself up or dwelling on it, but like extracting those lessons that can help you improve.
Exactly. And it creates an environment where others feel safe to take risks, to innovate, to learn from their own mistakes without fear of judgment.
Now, I'm curious, does O8.pdf address the downsides of humility? Because I'm
Yeah.
thinking sometimes being too humble could hold you back, like in a job interview or when you need to advocate for yourself.
That's a great question. And you're right, OA.pdf does acknowledge that.
Yeah.
There's a fine line between genuine humility and self-deprecation,
Yeah.
and that can be detrimental.
Yeah.
It emphasizes finding that balance,
Yeah.
recognizing your worth, advocating for your needs, but still staying humble and respectful.
So being assertive without being arrogant.
Exactly. Own your accomplishments, advocate for yourself, but don't let your ego take over.
I'm seeing how this all connects back to what we talked about with pessimism.
Mm.
A little bit of pessimism, that awareness of potential pitfalls, your limitations. It might actually help us develop true humility, because if we're too optimistic, too confident in ourselves, maybe we're less likely to acknowledge our need to grow.
Right. Less open to feedback, less willing to admit when we're wrong.
Yeah, and that closed-mindedness can really hold us back.
For sure.
But with a touch of pessimism, a dose of realism, we can approach the world with a more balanced and humble perspective.
And that openness to learning, to growing, that's at the core of true humility.
This has been so eye-opening. We've explored the benefits of pessimism and really gone deep into true humility. Before we wrap up, what are your final thoughts on what really stood out from these sources?
It's funny. I think both these concepts, pessimism and humility, they kind of point to a deeper understanding of ourselves,
Yeah.
and our place in the world.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's not just about adopting a mindset or a behavior. It's more about how how we navigate life.
Yeah, and these sources really highlight the importance of balance. We're not talking about becoming like a full-on pessimist or someone who just puts themselves down all the time.
Right. Find that sweet spot.
Exactly. So with pessimism, it's acknowledging challenges,
Yeah.
preparing for them, but not letting negativity just take over,
Humility. It's about recognizing your strengths, limitations, being open to feedback, willing to learn, but not pretending you haven't accomplished anything or that you don't have worth.
You got it. And it all comes back to self-awareness. The better we know ourselves, our tendencies, strengths, weaknesses, the better equipped we are to handle things.
Like a more realistic, well-rounded view of yourself.
Exactly. So As we wrap up this deep dive into pessimism and humility, I'll leave you with this thought. How can you use these insights in your life?
Maybe give that pre-mortem analysis a try before a big project, or really practice active listening when you're talking with others.
Or even just take a minute to think about your own tendencies. Are you more optimistic or pessimistic? How does your level of humility affect your relationships? How you learn new things?
Lots to think about. It's really about finding what works for you, that right balance of pessimism, optimism, humility, and knowing your own worth. That helps you really thrive.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights and maybe sparked some new ideas. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.